I represent the G24, formerly called the Intergovernmental Group of 24, which is, like AFI, a network of emerging markets and developing countries at the level of finance ministers and central bank governors. So we cover, of course, many issues, but one of the issues that has come to the fore is financial inclusion, and we are, as a group, very interested in financial inclusion. In that, our partner of choice is AFI. Indeed, I'm very proud that the G24 actually hosted the launch of AFI in Washington. So we were, in a sense, collaborators even before the founding of AFI. And since then, we are very much engaged in bringing policymakers into the fore of AFI, but also raising the awareness of AFI amongst policymakers in developing and emerging markets. Well, I mean, one of the aspects of financial inclusion that is striking is the specificity of the agenda to the country in question. Second, it's a very, very multifaceted endeavor. There isn't one, therefore, institution that can say, I am running the financial inclusion agenda. Indeed, one of our panelists this morning said, this is one area where you cannot have a solo flight. So in that context, perhaps the most important constraints on financial inclusion are constraints on leadership and constraints on coordination and engagement of relevant stakeholders. So what a national financial inclusion strategy does, it focuses the mind and on these two dimensions. It gets leaders convinced that this is something very important. It gets them to articulate their vision of what financial sector strategy is all about, and it provides a way of engaging the relevant stakeholders and indeed providing a kind of a game plan so that people can then implement a financial sector strategy with results. So that's why, rather than think about it as constraints, better to say, how does one deal with a vacuum or a lack of a clear frame in terms of national strategies? Well, SME development, like financial inclusion, is very much based on the lack of effective institutions. And in order to get SME development, you need to move beyond the traditional financial institutions, which typically cater to the better served institutions. So how do you ensure that in some sense you are tilting the balance of institutional incentives towards provision of credit to the SME? Just like in financial inclusion, it's not just an issue of credit. It's bringing together, again, many different factors that together create an enabling environment for SMEs. So you need, again, an SME strategy which is country specific and which addresses in some sense the constraints that an SME faces, not only with regard to credit, but with regard to knowledge, with regard to markets, and with regard to many other factors that together will enable it to operate successfully. So there's a lot of parallels between the financial access agenda and the SME agenda. Well, I think the starting point of this discourse that we are having right now is the Maya Declaration, and the reason for that is that there was some debate about should we come up with a global commitment on financial inclusion, and the discussion and the debate we had said no, actually strategies and commitments need to be bottom up. And that discussion led very much to the Maya Declaration, where countries came forward with national commitments, and those national commitments then together really became in some sense the Maya Declaration. But as that discourse showed, it's not enough to have commitments. You have to have a game plan to translate those commitments into action, and that's what national strategies are about. Even though these strategies are very national, very country specific, there is great value in peer learning, because you can learn from each other. Why? Because in some sense you are getting evidence that's grounded not in some theoretical models or whatever, but in real experience. Second, as the executive director Alfred Hennig said today, this is an equal dialogue. So people are very much more willing to learn from each other if there is kind of an interaction in some sense, not of being told what to do, but learning from the experience of others. And third, it's building up a body of evidence right now that allows us to tackle some of these constraints that we were talking about. So in some sense, you have commitments which came from the Maya Declaration, and from that you are having now national strategies that are being formulated. And in order to give these traction, and in order to make these in some sense the best of the best, the peer learning process can be extremely valuable. So these three things, commitments, national strategies, peer learning, are really part of the same process of learning. Well, SMEs, very interesting, because after this financial crisis, we had a major contraction of credit. That contraction of credit was perhaps nowhere more acute than it was for SMEs, not just in the developing countries, but even in developed countries. So it has shown that one needs to, in some sense, improve the information on which SME credit works. Okay. In developing countries, we have known for quite some time that if you want to deal with SMEs, you have to create an enabling environment that deals with their capacities, that deals with their access to information, that deals with their access to buyers. There are many things that have to fall into place. And SME finance is only one part of it. But nevertheless, finance is very important. So I expect that in the next 5 years, we will see significant strengthening of the infrastructure of SME finance, learning in some sense from best practices. Why is it, we have to ask ourselves, why is it that normal financial institutions are reluctant to lend to SMEs? And as we tackle those constraints at an individual country level, we will lubricate that part of the economy that actually contributes the most to growth. As I mentioned before, the Maya Declaration was a culmination of a process of recognizing that if we wanted to get global action, we had to build it on effective national commitments. And the Maya Declaration was, in some sense, a very effective mechanism for bringing together these diverse commitments, but with purpose. And Maya had some principles, but it accommodated this diversity. Now the question, as I said, is how do you translate that into action? It's a commitment, but what does it mean? How are you going to ensure at the end of the day you get results? And the only way you can do that is through effective national strategies. And as I mentioned at the outset, national strategies bring a couple of things that are absolutely critical to success. It brings leadership and accountability. It brings together clarity of which institutions are going to take responsibility for which constraints. It brings together a sense of results, and it brings together, very, very importantly, the kind of adaptations that need to be made in regulatory environment or other aspects that in some sense have impeded financial inclusion in the past. Well, the SME part, very candidly, did not figure so strongly in the Maya Declaration. The Maya Declaration was more about a broad-based financial inclusion strategy. So, if you think about financial inclusion, one side is the access of individuals to finance. The other is the access of enterprises to finance. And Financial inclusion is those individuals without access. SME finance is those enterprises that have most difficulty getting access to finance. So there are similarities, but the My Declaration itself focused more on access of individuals rather than access of enterprises. Well, I actually think that that this is a very, very exciting time. The most exciting part of it is the decision to establish AFI as a permanent network of peer learning amongst emerging markets and developing countries. In that, the goal of AFI, which is to use financial inclusion as a driver for poverty reduction and inclusive growth, will go a huge way in tackling the problems that we have. The beauty is that to see the kind of ownership, the drive, and in some sense the cross-learning that is taking place. So the agenda for the next 5 years, very honestly, is about as exciting as it gets.